Probably one of the raciest race cars we ever had. It looked like a race car, it ran like a race car. And after we got through running, I figured I just had to have one for the street, so this is what it is.
Petty's Garage has been a family operation building high-performance vehicles since 1949.
I'm Richard Petty, and this is Petty's Garage.
It is not just the cars that will stop you cold. It is when you discover that Richard Petty's Garage is a documentary of every turning point in his life. Richard Petty, a 7-time NASCAR Cup Series champion, has made his mark as one of the greatest stock car drivers in history. But what does it take to become such a man? Asking him might not get you the answer, but one look in his garage would show you. How does a boy survive a father who protested his own victory? And which car defined his climb to greatness? Join us as we reveal what they found in Richard Petty's garage. The 1957 Oldsmobile convertible. The first car that catches one's eye is a 1957 Oldsmobile convertible with a 371 cubic inch rocket V8 engine under its hood. At 216 inches long and weighing nearly 5,000 pounds, it's a massive machine from a brutal era of racing. But for Richard, this car was a reminder of the price he paid as a 21-year-old boy trying to become his own man while living under the crushing weight of a legend. Lee Petty wasn't just Richard's father. He was a pioneer of NASCAR, a 3-time champion who won the inaugural Daytona 500 in 1959. He built Petty Enterprises from nothing, turning it into a team that would eventually win 268 races and 10 championships. But they didn't go into racing as a hobby. It was a way to get out of the poverty they had come from. They had to win and make a buck just so they could go to the next race. Every win mattered, and Lee Petty's driving style reflected that desperation. Aggressive, ruthless, and utterly without sentiment. Richard grew up in that world, watching his father build an empire from nothing. Before he ever got behind the wheel, his father had won 54 races, setting a standard Richard was going to be measured against for the rest of his life. When Richard turned 20, Lee finally allowed him to race. His debut came on July 18, 1958, at a paved oval in Toronto. 2 weeks after his birthday, Richard climbed into a car for the first time in a Premier Series race. He was nervous, green, and desperate to prove himself, but his father had other ideas. Richard was running his own race when he saw his father's car in his mirror. Lee, driving his characteristic aggressive style, rammed his own son out of the way, spinning him out to secure the victory. Lee then officially protested Richard's scored position just to ensure his own win was uncontested. Richard finished the race, but the incident became one of the earliest and toughest lessons of his career, reinforcing just how unforgiving racing could be, even within his own family. Then came June 14, 1959, at Lakewood Speedway in Atlanta. Richard crossed the finish line first in his 1957 Oldsmobile convertible. At 21 years old, he had won his first NASCAR race. He was out of the car, jumping around, celebrating what he thought was his moment. Then someone came over and told him his father had protested the scoring. Lee argued that the officials had miscounted laps, that he had actually lapped Richard twice during a pit stop. According to Lee, he wanted Richard's win to be earned. But looking back now, there might have been another reason why Lee protested the scoring. So, NASCAR had offered a $250 bonus if the winner drove a convertible and a $450 bonus if the winner drove a 1959 model year car. Lee did the math. Richard's Oldsmobile qualified as a convertible, and his own Plymouth could earn them the extra $200. That was serious money in 1959. Richard went back to 0 career victories, but he didn't complain. He even admitted that all he cared about was that they had enough cars and money so he could keep racing. But proving he belonged would take more than one disputed victory. It would require finding an identity that no one, not even his father, could take away. The 1964 Plymouth Belvedere. It's hard to miss this machine in the middle of the garage, and that's because of its electric paint job, a shade of blue that seems to glow even in dim light. The story goes that it was late in 1959, during Lee's championship-winning season. Richard and his brother Maurice were working around 2 or 3 in the morning on a wrecked Petty car, rushing to get it ready for a race. They had a bucket of dark blue paint and a bucket of white paint, but not enough of either to cover the whole car. In a moment of pure, exhausted improvisation, they mixed them. The result was a light, vibrant shade of blue that was completely accidental. Petty Blue was born, and that mistake became Richard's trademark. For the next 5 years after Richard's debut race, he kept trying to make his mark. But aside from dealing with his father's fame, Richard had a struggle most fans never consider. You see, Richard Petty stands 6 feet 2 inches tall. In an era when most drivers were shorter and stockier, Richard's lanky frame was a constant source of discomfort. The cockpits of 1960s stock cars were cramped and designed for bodies of more modest proportions. The steering wheels were large, the pedals were close, and the seat positions were fixed. Richard had to physically cram his long limbs into that hot, tight space, contorting his body in ways that would cause back pain and exhaustion over the course of a 500-mile race. But in 1964, he fought against all odds and proved himself to the world. It was the 1964 Daytona 500. He had started on the front row, but early in the race, he fell to 15th. Most people thought it was going to be another near victory, but then the Hemi's raw power took over. 26-year-old Richard led 184 of the 200 laps, beating second-place finisher Jimmy Pardue by 1 lap and 9 seconds. It was the most dominant performance in Daytona 500 history. Richard was no longer just a Petty. He was now his own person, the king. Winning the biggest race of his life was one thing, but what does it feel like to reach a level of dominance so absolute that it becomes almost terrifying? The 1967 Plymouth Belvedere. This car is a battle-scarred warhorse, a machine that looks like it has been through 100 wars and won every single one. And if we judge it by its looks, we'd be right, because the year 1967 was the year Richard Petty became a force of nature that the sport has never seen since. Statistically, Richard's 1967 campaign was the greatest single season in NASCAR history. Over the course of that season, he won 27 of 48 races. To put that in perspective, modern drivers celebrate winning a handful of races a year. Richard won more than half the time, a winning percentage of nearly 60%, which itself is another record. During this stretch, Richard set another record of winning 10 consecutive races and recorded 38 top 5 finishes and 40 top 10s, with 18 poles. He led more than 5,500 laps over the course of the season. These are numbers that modern racers look upon in awe. But behind the numbers was a story of immense human pressure. Sure, Richard was at the absolute top of his game, and that meant he had to maintain that height. After achieving things that defy logic, he couldn't go back to being ordinary, even if he wanted to. In that season, he didn't even have competitions, and that must have made him very lonely at the top. Richard had conquered NASCAR. The next challenge wasn't another driver, it was the business of the sport itself. The 1970 Plymouth Superbird. It's impossible to look away from this car. It is wild and so eccentric, as if it belongs in a science fiction movie. The giant rear wing looms high above the trunk, and the long, pointed nose cone looks like it's trying to pierce the air itself. This is the Plymouth Superbird, a car that exists because Richard Petty proved he was bigger than the manufacturers who built the cars. In 1969, Richard left Plymouth for Ford. It was a shocking move. Richard Petty was synonymous with Plymouth. Seeing him in a Ford was a corporate nightmare. Plymouth panicked. Losing their star was a PR disaster they couldn't afford. But Richard had leverage. He told Plymouth he might return if they built an aerodynamic car for him to race. So Plymouth went back to the drawing board and engineered the radical Superbird, a car designed specifically to lure Richard back for the 1970 season. When Richard first saw it, he thought it looked like a rocket ship. It was a massive gamble, a car that was really ahead of its time. Production models later languished on showroom floors, in part because NASCAR increased the homologation requirement from 500 units to 2,000. But on the track, the Superbird was a monster. This was the moment Richard realized his own worth. He could leverage his talent to force a corporate giant to change its strategy. He was no longer just a driver from Level Cross, North Carolina. He was a mainstream American cultural force. The car became synonymous with his name. He even signed the last unit produced. Decades later, one of Richard's 1970 Superbirds would be offered at auction, with bids reaching $3.5 million. But its true value isn't monetary. It's the value of a man who realized he could stand up to an entire industry and win. With such immense power and a new corporate giant backing him, what else could possibly challenge the king? The 1974 Dodge Charger. Ever wondered Richard's most favorite car of all the cars he ever raced? It's the 1974 Dodge Charger. The red and blue paint scheme was born of a legendary standoff. In 1972, Andy Granatelli's STP oil treatment signed on as a sponsor, offering an amazing deal. But there was a catch. Granatelli wanted the entire car painted his signature Dayglow red. But that was difficult for Richard to agree to. He had his identity as the guy in the Petty blue cars. After building his reputation for so long, he had become fiercely protective of it and threatened to walk away from the entire deal. Eventually, both parties reached a compromise, and that was the iconic split scheme. The front half red for STP, the back half Petty blue. The color combination even extended to the interior of the Charger, with blue as the main color and a fire extinguisher in STP red. It was a perfect metaphor for his career, a blend of his own identity and the commercial demands of the sport. This Charger also carried him into his legendary wars with rival David Pearson. The two drivers had a deep, respect-fueled rivalry that captivated the nation. Perhaps the most famous moment came in the 1976 Daytona 500. On the final lap, Richard and David were battling for the lead when they crashed into each other. David's car managed to limp across the finish line first, while Richard's car stalled just short of the line. These were two legends pushing each other to the absolute limit, neither willing to give an inch. Pearson would finish his career with 105 victories, but it was the battles between them that fans remembered. The 1974 Charger also carried Richard to another championship. He won his fifth Daytona 500 that year in this very car. It raced through January 1978, when Petty drove it one last time at Riverside International Raceway. The car represents endurance, the ability to stay at the top for decades, to navigate the changing landscape of the sport, to maintain excellence when others fade. Richard Petty didn't just win in the 1960s and 1970s, he kept winning into the 1980s. And he did it all while wearing that split red and blue paint scheme. As this era of commercialism and fierce rivalries defined his career, What would be the final capstone to a legendary run? The 1984 Pontiac Grand Prix. This car is sleeker, a product of the 1980s, and it carries a different energy. It's the 1984 Pontiac Grand Prix, and it's not just a race car, it's a time machine, back to a moment when sports and political history collided. The date was July 4th, 1984. The place was Daytona International Speedway. Richard Petty was 47 years old, and many had written him off. He hadn't won in years. But on that sweltering Florida afternoon, he would cement his legacy forever. He won the Firecracker 400, outdueling Cale Yarborough by the width of his front bumper. It was his 200th and final career victory, a number that had seemed unbreakable since the moment it was reached. But that wasn't the only headline. Sitting in a VIP suite, watching the race, was the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. It was the first time a sitting president had ever attended a NASCAR race. Reagan stuck around until the end and even did a few laps of radio play-by-play during the race. After Richard's victory, Reagan congratulated him and then ate chicken with drivers, crew members, and their families in the garage area. The presence of Reagan ensured national headlines. It wasn't just a racing story, it was an American story. The image of the cowboy-hatted king shaking hands with the cowboy president was the perfect symbol of NASCAR's arrival on the national stage. It was no longer a regional Southern sport. It was an American institution. Richard Petty, the boy from Level Cross who had grown up without electricity or running water on a North Carolina tobacco farm, was now shaking hands with the President of the United States. It was the American dream, played out at 200 miles per hour. The 1984 Pontiac Grand Prix is a monument to the grand finale. It represents the moment a sports icon transitions into an enduring American myth. Richard had won his 200th race. He had met the president. What more could there possibly be? How does a king gracefully exit his throne? The 1992 Pontiac Grand Prix. The final car in the garage is another Pontiac Grand Prix, but that doesn't make it the least in Richard's garage. The 1992 season was Richard Petty's Fan Appreciation Tour, a year-long goodbye to the sport he had defined. The final race of the season was the Hooters 500 at Atlanta Motor Speedway. For Richard, it wasn't about winning, it was about surviving. The race was chaotic. On a restart, in the first half of the event, Petty, already not on the lead lap, was involved in an accident with several other cars. Not of his making, his car caught fire. Jeff Gordon, a 21-year-old rookie making his Cup Series debut that day, remembered the moment vividly. "I remember seeing Richard in a ball of flames out there." Petty's crew worked frantically to rebuild the wrecked car so he could drive it back out and cross the finish line one last time. They succeeded. He completed 95 laps before the crash. But the image that fans remember isn't the crash. It's the determination. It's the crew refusing to let their king end his career in a fireball. It's Richard climbing back into a rebuilt car and taking those final laps. Meanwhile, Jeff Gordon was having his own inauspicious debut. He crashed out after 164 laps and finished 31st. Richard's final race was Gordon's first. It was a poetic and literal passing of the torch. The old king was stepping down, and a new era was beginning. Gordon would go on to win 93 Cup races and 7 championships of his own. But on that day in Atlanta, he was just a kid watching a legend say goodbye. Richard Petty had done everything there was to do. He had won 200 races. He had won 7 championships. He had met presidents. He had survived crashes that would have killed lesser men. Now it was time to let someone else carry the torch. After a career that spanned decades and defined a sport, what does the king do with the rest of his life? The king today. Leaving the garage behind, we find the living legend. At 89 years old, Richard Petty hasn't changed. You can spot him from a mile away. He still refuses to go anywhere without his signature feathered cowboy hat and dark sunglasses. But his life today is about more than his past glories. At a point, he was an active team owner for Legacy Motor Club alongside Jimmy Johnson, ensuring his presence is still felt in the sport he loves. Now, he is still deeply tied to the club and serves as an ambassador. His heart lies in the rolling hills of Randolph County, North Carolina, at Victory Junction. The racing-themed medical camp was built to honor his late grandson, Adam, who was tragically killed in a practice crash in 2000. Adam had the idea for the camp before he died, inspired by a similar camp built by actor and racer Paul Newman. So the family turned their devastating grief into a philanthropic triumph. Today, the camp serves thousands of children with chronic illnesses, giving them a chance to experience a childhood they often miss out on. Richard Petty has lived a life so full it seems like a myth. He went from a boy trying to escape his father's shadow to a king who became bigger than his sport. He proved his worth, built an empire, and then, when the time came, gracefully passed the torch. As he stands in his garage, surrounded by the cars that carried him through life, it's clear he has built a kingdom that will last forever. Do you think Richard Petty's relationship with his father ever truly healed? Or did that 1959 protest leave a wound that no amount of victories could ever close? And after everything, do you think Richard Petty would do it all again, or would he walk away? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.